She was already inside the shrine when she made the decision that would change everything. Not the decision to love him. That decision had already been made the moment Emeka looked at her across the morning market and saw a woman where everyone else had always seen only a priestess. No, the decision she made inside the shrine at midnight, alone, with the god's attention pressing against her skin like heat from a fire she could not see, was a different kind of decision entirely. It was a decision to speak, to open her mouth inside the most sacred space in the entire village of Inquiry and say directly to the God who owned her life the words that no consecrated woman had ever said to the deity that claimed her. She said, "You are wrong. The flame on the altar did not move. The shrine did not shake. The thunder did not come. But the silence that followed those three words was the loudest silence Adaeze had ever stood inside. The silence of a God who has just heard something it had never heard before and is deciding what to do with it." But to understand what she was doing in that shrine at midnight and why she said what she said and what happened after she said it, you need to go back to the beginning. Back to a man who was hungry and desperate and made a promise he had no right to make. Back to the night everything started. Chukwueze was not a bad man. That is important to say clearly before anything else in this story, because bad men make bad bargain for selfish reason, and Chukwueze's reason, though it destroyed his daughter's life, was the only reason a man of his time and place understood as sufficient. He was starving. Not the inconvenience of hunger, the specific bodily reality of watching your children's rib become visible through their skin, of waking up at night to the sound of your wife trying not to make noise while she cries from the pain of an empty stomach, of standing in a field you have worked with your hands every day for 3 seasons and watching it produce nothing, absolute nothing, as though the earth itself had decided to refuse you. 2 of his neighbors had already buried children that year. He had 3. So on Tuesday nights, when the moon was full and the shrine of Amadioha glowed with specific lights that shrine carry when the deity inside them is awake and listening, Chukwueze walked there alone without telling his wife where he was going. He knelt at the altar. He placed the only offering he had left that was worth anything, a white hen, the last one, the one his wife had been keeping for a ceremony that would now not happen. And he said the words. He said, "Amadioha, God of thunder and justice, I am coming before you with nothing but this bed and my desperation. Save my harvest. Save my children from what is coming. And the first child my wife delivers after this night belongs to you. I swear it on my blood and on my father's grave, and on every name I carry." The flame on the altar bent towards him once, then straightened. Amadioha had heard. Amadioha had accepted. The harvest that followed was the best anyone in Nkwere could remember in 3 generations. The rain came exactly when they were needed and stopped exactly when they should. The crops grew faster and taller and fuller than anything the village had seen. Neighbors came to look at Chukwueze's farm with specific expression people wear when they cannot explain what they are seeing. He fed his children. He fed his wife. He had enough left over to trade. 3 months later, his wife went into labor. She delivered a girl, a beautiful, loud, certain girl who arrived in the world like she had somewhere important to be and was already running late. Chukwueze held his daughter and looked at her face and felt the vow he had made sitting in his chest like a stone he had swallowed. He named her Adaeze, daughter of a king, which was either the most loving thing he could have done or the cruelest joke a desperate man ever played on himself without meaning to. Because she was not the daughter of a king, she was the property of a god. The gods, unlike things, do not forget what they are owned. Adaeze grew up knowing what she was, not because her father told her directly. He never did. He carried that particular cowardice to his grave, which came earlier than it should have, as though the guilt of what he had promised shutting him from the inside. She knew because the village treated her differently from the moment she was old enough for the treatment to register. Other girls were allowed to play near the river until sunset. Adaeze was called home an hour earlier without explanation. Other girls were spoken to freely by young men of the village. When a man spoke to Adaeze, the elders appeared from whatever direction they had been watching from, and the young man found something else to do immediately. Other girls talked about who they would marry, about the children they would have, about the compounds they would build their life inside. Adaeze did not have those conversations. Not because nobody told her she could not. Nobody ever told her directly. It was communicated the way the most permanent things in a village are communicated, through the specific quality of silence that falls when certain subjects came near, through the look that passed between adults over her head when she was young and around her when she was older, through the thousand small redirections that together built the walls of the life she was allowed to live. When she was 12, the chief priest of Amadioha's shrine came to their compound. He sat with her mother for a long time. Her mother cried quietly with the specific restraints of a woman who understood that crying loudly would not change anything and would only exhaust her. When the priest left, her mother called Adaeze inside and told her everything. Adaeze listened to everything her mother said without interrupting. When her mother finished, she sat in silence for a long time. Then she asked one question. She asked, "Did my father know what he was promising when he made that vow?" Her mother looked at the floor, which was answer enough. Adaeze nodded. She did not cry. She was 12 years old and she did not cry. And her mother would later say that was the moment she understood her daughter had been built for something harder than ordinary grief could break. 2 weeks later, Adaeze moved into the shrine compound. She began her training as the voice of Amadioha in human world. She was good at it, frighteningly good, as though the god whose property she was had made her specifically for this purpose, and her aptitude for it was simply evidence of the original design. She learned the sacred calendar, the ritual requirements, the specific language of divine communication that the priest used to interpret the god's response to human petition. She learned when to speak in the god's name and when to be silent in it. She learned the laws of Amadioha, the thing the god considers just, the thing he considered unforgivable, the specific hierarchy of offense that would bring his attention down on a person or community. She learned them all. She learned them so well that by the time she was 20, she was more fluent in the god's law than the chief priest himself, who had served the shrine for 40 years, and she accepted her life. That is the most important thing to understand about Adaeze before Emeka arrives. She was not a prisoner waiting for rescue. She was not a woman counting the days until some external force changed her circumstances. She had looked at the life she had been given without her consent, and she had decided, with the most quiet completeness she brought to everything, to inhabit it fully. She had made peace with never being loved by a man. She had made peace with never having children. She had made peace with belonging to a god instead of herself. And then Emeka walked into the morning market on a Wednesday in the dry season and looked at her. And 20 years of carefully constructed peace developed its first crack. He was not remarkable to look at. Adaeze would think about this later, about how the people who rearranged her life are almost never the ones who would have predicted from their appearance. Emeka was tall and had an honest face, and moved through the crowded market with the specific ease of a man who is comfortable wherever he finds himself. That was all. He was looking at a boat of clothes being sold by one of the market women when he glanced up and saw Adaeze standing 3 stalls away. And he looked at her the way she had described, not with the careful averted gaze that every man in inquiry had learned to give her, not with the reverent distance that the God's claim on her required from everyone who knew what she was. He simply looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a man who had seen a woman who interests him and has not yet been told the 17 reasons he should look somewhere else. Adaeze looked back for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away and walked in the opposite direction with the controlled pace of a woman who has spent 20 years controlling everything, including the direction of her own attention. It did not help. He found her the next morning at the well outside the shrine compound. Not looking, not pursuing. He had come to the shrine to petition Amadioha about a trading matter and arrived early, and she was drawing water, and he said, "Good morning," in the direct, uncomplicated way he did everything. She said good morning back. That was all. But the shrine attendant who witnessed it mentioned it to the junior priest, who mentioned it to the senior priest, who filed it in the part of his mind reserved for things that needed washing. The next day, Emeka came back to the shrine compound. Not to petition. He had forgotten something, he said, though what he had forgotten was never clearly established. Adaeze was in the outer courtyard tending the ritual fire. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing of consequence. The weather, his journey to Nkwere, the quality of the yams in the market, the kind of conversation that is entirely about something else, and both people know it, and neither one acknowledges it. He left. She tended the fire, and the crack that had appeared in 20 years of peace became something wider. 3 days became a week became 2. He found reason to be near the shrine compound every day. The reason were increasingly thin, and both of them pretended not to notice this. They talked the way people talk when they are actually saying something else entirely. About his home village and what it was like to grow up near the river. About what she missed from childhood before the shrine. About the specific quality of silence in the compound at night when the ritual fire were low and the village was asleep. He told her that he found her remarkable. Not the way people found the God's priestess remarkable. Not with the respectful distance of the sacred. He meant her, specifically, the way her mind worked, the way she said difficult things simply, the way she laughed with a quietness that suggests she had opinions about laughter itself and had decided this particular amount was the right amount of this particular moment. Adaeze sat with that sentence for 3 days. Nobody had ever meant her before. They had meant the priestess. They had meant the God's voice. They had meant the sacred woman in the white wrapper clothes who carried divine communication between the human world and the supernatural one. Nobody had ever looked past all of that and meant the person underneath it. The crack became a fraction. On the 15th day, Emeka told her he was supposed to have left Nkwere 12 days ago. His trading partner were waiting. His goods were sitting in a storeroom, costing him money every day they stayed there. He had sent 3 messages ahead explaining his delay with reason that became progressively less convincing. She asked him why he was still here. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "I think you know why." Adaeze looked at the ritual fire. She thought about 20 years of peace and the gods who owned her and the laws she had memorized so completely she could recite them in her sleep. She thought about the specific law that governed her situation. The one that said a consecrated woman who gave her heart to a mortal man had committed the highest offense against the deity that claimed her. That the man would be destroyed, that the woman would be destroyed, that the destruction would extend outward like rain in water to everyone who had witnessed it and said nothing. She knew this law better than anyone alive. She had taught it to the younger priests. She looked at the man sitting across from her who had stayed 12 days past his leaving because of her. And the fraction became something that could not be undone. She said, "I know why." And neither of them said anything else for a long time. But what was between them had been named now. And named things have a life of their own. The village noticed. Village always notice. A community that has lived together long enough develops a collective awareness that functions like a single organism. Individual people might miss things. The village as a whole misses almost nothing. They noticed the trader who had stayed too long. They noticed where he spent his mornings. They noticed the specific quality of Adaeze's composure when his name came up in conversation. The way it became slightly more deliberate. The way controlled things became more controlled when something is working against the control from the inside. They noticed and they said nothing. Not out of malice, not out of approval exactly, out of the specific human unwillingness to be the person who stands between two people and something that looks against all the rules governing it, like love. Also out of fear, because reporting what they saw meant going to the shrine, meant standing before the chief priest and saying, "There is something you need to know about the ghost woman," and the person who said that statement would spend the rest of their life knowing they had said it, would carry the specific weight of having been the one who brought the god's attention down on a love story. Nobody wanted to be that person. So the village watched and knew and kept its collective mouth shut and hoped that whatever was happening would resolve itself quietly before it became something the gods noticed on its own. That hope was wrong. It was always going to be wrong. Because Amadioha does not wait for reports. Amadioha watches. He has always watched everything. The first sign came on a Thursday morning. Emeka woke in the room he had been renting at the compound of a trader named Obiora and found that his legs would not hold him. Not paralyzed, not injured, just suddenly and completely unable to bear his weight, as though the ground beneath him has decided to stop cooperating. He lay on his mat for 3 hours before Obiora's wife found him. By afternoon, he could stand. By evening, he could walk. He told himself it was the food, the water, the body's protest at too many weeks away from home. He told himself this because the alternative explanation required him to believe something he was not yet ready to believe. The second sign came the following Tuesday. Obiora, the man whose compound Emeka was renting, went to his farm at dawn and found every crop he had planted that season dead, overnight. Not wilted, not sick, dead with the specific completeness of things that have been dead for weeks, as though time had accelerated specifically for this man's farm and left everything around it untouched. His neighbor's farm was fine. The farm on the other side was fine. Only Obiora's. Obiora stood in the ruins of his harvest and looked at his neighbor's green and healthy crops on both sides and understood with the cold certainty of a man who had lived his whole life in a village with a god in it, exactly what this matter meant. He went home. He told his wife to pack what was essential. He told Emeka he needed the room back. When Emeka asked why, Obiora looked at him with an expression that was not anger and not blame, but simply the exhausted recognition of a man who had watched something unfold and understood too late that his silence had made him part of it. He said, "You need to leave Nkwere." He said, "You need to leave today." He did not say anything else. The third sign came the same afternoon. The shrine attendant who had first noticed Emeka at the well and had mentioned it to the junior priest woke from an afternoon rest, unable to open his right eye. Not infected, not injured, simply sealed shut, as though something had decided that an eye which had seen what it had seen and said what it had said should be reminded of its own limited usefulness. The junior priest, who had carried the information upwards, lost his voice that evening. Completely, between one sentence and the next, mid-conversation, gone. He opened his mouth and nothing came out, and the look on his face was the look of a man who had suddenly understood that the God he serves has his very long memory and a very specific sense of what constitutes complicity. Because carrying information is not the same as acting on it. And Amadioha, God of justice, had decided that everyone in this story bore some portion of the consequence. The shrine attendant who saw and whispered. The junior priest who heard and passed it along without urgency. The senior priest who filed it away as something to watch rather than something to stop. The neighbor who saw and smiled. The market women who knew and gossiped quietly among themselves. The elders who had the authority to intervene and choose the comfort of not being involved. One by one, with the specific precision of a God who had reviewed every person's role in this story and assigned each one exactly the portion of consequences their participation deserved. The village of Nkwere was being taken apart, person by person, and everyone knew why. Adaeze heard about it the way she heard about everything that happened in Nkwere, through the specific quality of silence that descended around her when she walked through the compound, through the way the other shrine attendants moved slightly differently in her presence, through the conversation that stopped when she entered the room and resumed a different register when she left it. She went to find Emeka. He was packing. His goods were already bundled and tied. He was moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who has understood that speed is now the most important thing available to him. When he saw her, he stopped. She looked at him for a long time. She said, "How are your legs?" He looked at her with the expression of a man who had not expected that to be the first thing she said and understood immediately what it meant that it was. He said, "Better." She said, "Leave today. Do not stop until you are 3 villages from here. Do not come back." He said her name. She held up her hand. She said, "What is happening to this village is because of me. Because of what I felt and what I allowed myself to feel, and what every person who saw it chose to do with what they saw. I will not add to it by letting you stay." He said, "What will happen to you?" She looked at him with the specific calmness of a woman who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. She said, "That is not your concern." He said, "It is my concern. It is entirely my concern. I am the one who stayed. I am the one who came back every day. I am the one who said what I said and let things become what it became." She said, "I am the one who knew the law and felt what I felt anyways. We are equally responsible, and I am telling you that the most useful thing you can do with your half of that responsibility is to leave." He stood in the middle of his packed room and looked at her. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. She said, "Go." He went. She stood in the doorway of the empty room and listened to his footsteps on the compound path until she could not hear them anymore. Then she stood there a while longer, just in case. Then she turned around and walked towards the shrine. The punishment continued after Emeka left. Adaeze had hoped in the part of her that still hoped things, that his departure would satisfy whatever accounting the gods was conducting. It did not, because Emeka's leaving did not undo what had happened, did not return the village to the state it had been in before, did not erase the 15 days of his presence or the feeling that had grown in those days, or the community's collective decision to witness and say nothing. Amadioha was not punishing what might happen. He was punishing what had happened, and what had happened could not be unpacked and returned. The market women who had smiled knowingly and said nothing developed a tremor in her hands that made it impossible to hold her goods without dropping them. Her livelihood, built on the steadiness of those hands over 30 years of trading, was gone in a morning. The elder who had seen Emeka at the shrine compound 3 times and made the deliberate decision not to act on what he saw found that his youngest son, healthy and strong the day before, could not be woken one morning, breathing, heartbeats, but unreachable, sitting in a specific, not quite death that the god seems to prefer as a punishment, presence enough to cause maximum grief, absent enough to cause maximum happiness. The neighbor who had watched and gossiped quietly among themselves found that their gossip had somehow reached their children, that their children were now being avoided by other children of the village, that the social fabric of their family in the community had developed tears that would take years to repair. Precision. That was the word that kept arriving in Adaeze's mind as she moved through the village watching it happen. Not rage, not the indiscriminate destruction of a god who was simply angry and breaking things. Precision. Each punishment was calibrated exactly to the specific nature of each person's participation. The thing taken from each person was always the thing most connected to what they had done or failed to do. A god of justice, administering justice, by his own definition of the word. Adaeze walked through all of it. She walked through the market women's trembling hand, and the elder's unreachable song, and the neighbor's fractured social standing, and the shrine attendant's sealed eyes, and the junior priest's missing voice. She walked through all of it, and she thought about justice, about what the word meant, about whether what she was witnessing qualified for it. She had been consecrated to a God of justice since before she could understand what either of those words meant. She had spent 20 years learning his laws, speaking in his name, administering his requirements to the human being who came to the shrine with their petition and their offering and their desperate needs. She had believed in him. She had believed that the justice he administered was real justice, that his law was right law, that the order he maintained in human world through his priest and his shrine and his consecrated woman was an order worth maintaining. And now she walked through a village being punished for watching a woman feel something she had not chosen to feel. And she thought about justice. And she thought about her father kneeling at an altar before she was born and promising something that was not his to promise. And she thought about a God who accepted that promise, who had taken a child who had no say in his arrangement, who had built a law around that child's life and then punished the child and everyone around her for the law's own inevitable failure. Because this was the thing Adaeze understood that nobody else in Nkwere had the specific knowledge to understand. Amadioha had made her what she was. He had taken a human woman and put her in a human world and surrounded her with human beings and expected her to be something other than human, and then punished her for being exactly what he had made her. She thought about this for 3 days. On the 4th day, she walked to the shrine at midnight and stood before the altar and said, "You are wrong." The shrine was different at midnight. Adaeze had been inside it at every hour of the day and night, over 20 years of service. She knew its specific quality at dawn and when the ritual fire were being lit for the day. At midday when the petitioners came with their request. At dusk when the offering were completed and the fire banked. At the deep hours of the night when the shrine attendant slept and she sometimes walked through alone to check the fire. She had never felt it like this. The air inside the shrine had weight, the specific pressure of a space that contains something vast, paying focused attention. Every surface seemed to breathe. The pattern on the wall shifted at the edge of vision in a way that had nothing to do with the firelight. The altar flame was burning twice its normal height. The goddess was awake and aware and had been expecting her. That last thing she understood from the quality of the waiting in the room, the specific quality of a presence that is not surprised, that had watched her make her decision over 3 days and had simply waited for her to arrive at the place that decision led. She stood before the altar and said the words, "You are wrong." And the silence that followed was the silence of something deciding whether this particular human being has earned the right to be answered. Adaeze stood in that silence and did not flinch. She had not come here to flinch. She said, "I have served you for 20 years. I have spoken in your name and administered your laws and brought your requirements to the human being who came to this shrine with their broken lives and their desperate needs. I have done this faithfully. I have done it well." She said, "My father made a promise he had no right to make. He promised you something that was not his to promise because I had not yet been born, and a person cannot promise before they exist because they are not yet anyone's to give." She said, "You accepted that promise. You knew what you were accepting. You knew a child would be born into a depth she had not made, and you accepted it anyway." She said, "And then you put me in a human world. Among human beings, you gave me human hearts and human feeling and a few human capacity for connection and love. And you surrounded me with people and you placed me in a community and you expect me to be stone." She said, "And when I was not stone, when I felt what every human being feels when someone sees them and means them and stays for them, you punished me. You punished a market woman's hands and an elder son and a neighbor who were guilty only for being human enough to find a love story more interesting than a law." She said, "That is not justice." She said, "I knew your laws better than any living person in this village. I have memorized them and taught them and lived by them. And I am telling you, with 20 years of service standing behind me, that what you are doing to this village is not what your own law says justice is." She said, "Your law says punishment must match offense. Your law says collective punishment requires collective guilt. Your law says that a God who claims a human being takes responsibility for what that human being is." She said, "You made me human. The offense was human. The punishment is wrong." The altar flames went out completely. For the first time in the recorded memory of anyone who had ever served this shrine, the altar flame of Amadioha went out. The shrine was completely dark. And in the darkness, something happened that Adaeze would spend the rest of her life trying to find adequate language for. The darkness listened. This is the only way she could ever describe it afterward. The darkness in that shrine was not the ordinary absence of light. It was an active presence, something that had taken the form of darkness, the way water takes the form of whatever contains it. Something vast and old and capable of attention, occupying the space around her and attending to what she had said. She stood in it for a very long time. She did not move. She did not speak again. She had said what she had come to say. Now she waits. A god can kill a human being in any number of ways. She has catalogued enough of them in 20 years of service to know that death in the shrine of the gods you had just accused of injustice was not outside the range of available outcome for this night. She had accepted this before she walked through the shrine door. That acceptance was perhaps the thing that saved her. Or perhaps it was the argument itself. Or perhaps it was 20 years of faithful service laid behind the argument like a foundation. Or perhaps Amadioha, god of thunder and justice, was capable of something that gods are rarely credited with: the capacity to be wrong and to know it. The altar flame returned. Not dramatically, it simply reappeared to its normal light, steady, still, the same flame it had always been. And Adaeze understood from the quality of the room after its return that something had shifted. Not disappeared, not dissolved, something had shifted. The god had not agreed with her. Gods do not agree with human beings, but the god had heard her. And hearing and agreeing are not the same thing. But hearing is a kind of acknowledgement, and acknowledgement is a kind of movement. And movement in a god who had been fixed in this position is nothing. It is nothing at all. The punishment stopped. Not immediately, not all at once. The way pain that has been building does not stop the moment the cause is removed, but take time to unwind from the body. The market woman's trembling hands steadied over 3 days. First, less frequently, then less severely. Then on the 4th morning, she picked up her goods without thinking about it and realized at midday that she had not dropped anything. The elder son opened his eyes on the 2nd morning, sat up, asked for water. His father sat beside him and wept with the specific abandon of a man who had been holding that weeping inside since the morning his son was not awake. The shrine attendant's eyes opened. The junior priest's voice returned. Not as immediate gifts, as things that had been held and were now being released. Slowly, in the specific order of their taking. The village of Nkwere exhaled. Collectively, the specific communal exhale of people who had been holding their breath and had finally received permission to breathe. And then the elders came to the shrine, all 7 of them. They came in the morning with their kola nuts and their palm wine, and they petitioned for an audience with the priestess. And when she came out to meet them, they were all looking at the ground. The oldest elder spoke. He said, "We know what you did." He said, "We know you went to the shrine alone at midnight, and we know what that means, and we know what it cost." He said, "We should have acted earlier. We should have been the ones to address what was happening instead of leaving it for you to carry." He said, "We failed you." Adaeze looked at the 7 oldest men in Nkwere with their hands bowed and their offering in their hands. She thought about the night in the shrine, about the darkness and what it contained, and the long silence of something ancient, hearing something it had perhaps not expected to hear. She thought about her father kneeling at the same shrine before she existed, promising something that was not his to give. She thought about Emeka and the 15 days and the look on his face in the doorway of the packed room. She thought about 20 years of service to a god she had just stood before in complete darkness and accused of being wrong. She looked at the 7 elders and she said, "Yes, you failed me." And then she said, "I accept your acknowledgement." And she went back inside the shrine. Now, here is where the story takes the turn that nobody expects. The turn I have been carrying this whole time, waiting for the right moment to place in your hands. 3 months after the night in the shrine, Adaeze requested a formal audience with the chief priest. She presented herself in full ritual dress, white wrapper, chalk marking, the ceremonial beads she had worn for 20 years in service. She knelt before the altar, and she laid every item of her consecration on the ground before it. The beads, the ritual staff, the ceremonial clothes, every physical marker of what she was. She said, "I am returning what I was given." Not in defiance, not in anger, in the specific calm of a woman who has understood something clearly and is acting on that understanding with complete precision. She said, "I was consecrated by a promise made over me before I existed. I have served faithfully for 20 years. I have given what was asked and more than what was asked. And I stood before these gods in his own shrine and said something through, and the shrine is still standing, and I am still standing, and I believe that means something." She said, "I believe it means the debt my father made is paid." She said, "I believe it means I have earned the right to be only human now." The chief priest looked at the item laid before the altar. He looked at the woman who had laid them there. He looked at the altar flame. The altar flame did not move. It did not go out. It did not burn higher. It simply burned, as it always had. The chief priest sat with that stillness for a very long time. He was an old man. He had served the shrine for 40 years. He had seen things in that service that had taught him to read the God's silence as carefully as his declaration. He reads this one. He looked at Adaeze and he nodded. She walked out of the shrine that morning as something she has not been since before she was born. Her own, belonging to no one but herself. The village watched her walk through the compound and nobody spoke. Not because they were afraid, because there are moments in a community's life that announces themselves as significant before anyone has had time to process exactly why. Moments that carried everyone's presence will later describe to their children. Will say, "I was there that morning. I saw her walk out of the shrine. I saw her face. I knew something had changed. Something permanent. Something that would not be changed back." She never saw Emeka again. That is the part of this story that people find hardest to accept. They want her to find him. They want the love story to complete itself. They want the 15 days and the packed room and the look in the doorway to be repaid with a reunion. I understand that want. I want it too. But here is what actually happened. Adaeze sent a message to Emeka's home village 3 months after leaving the shrine. The messenger returned with the news that Emeka had married. A woman from his home village, a march that had been arranged before he left on the trading journey that brought him to Nkwere. A march his family had been waiting on his return to complete. He had come back from Nkwere and married her within the months. Adaeze sat with this information for a long time. She thought about 15 days, about a man who had stayed 12 days past his leaving, about the look in the doorway of the packed room. She thought about the specific nature of things that are true in the moment they occur and do not require permanent consequences to have them being real. She thought about the 15 days as a complete thing, not a beginning that was interrupted, a complete thing in itself, with its own wholeness, its own meaning, its own value that does not depend on what came after. She decided to keep it that way, to hold it as exactly what it was. 15 days of being seen and meant and chosen by someone who had no prior instruction about who she was supposed to be. Not a tragedy, Not a love story interrupted, just 15 days, complete and whole and enough. She did not live in Nkwere. People assumed she would, that a woman released from 20 years of consecration would want distance from the shrine and the village and the gods and everything associated with all of them. She stayed. She said this was her home, that the shrine was part of her home, the way a difficult chapter is part of a complete book, that living would be a kind of dishonesty about her own history and she was not interested in. She became something the village had no existing category for. A woman who had served a god and left the service, who know the laws better than the current priest, who people came to with their spiritual questions, not because she held any official position, but because she had stood in the darkness of the shrine at midday and argued with Amadioha and walked back out. And the gods had let her, which meant something. Nobody was entirely sure what it meant, but they came to her anyway, and she answered them in her own voice, for the first time in her life, speaking as herself and no one else. The chief priest died 7 years later. The shrine elder convened to choose his successor. They deliberated for 3 days. On the 4th day, they came to Adaeze's compound. They said, "We would like you to lead the shrine, not as a consecrated woman, not as the god's property, as a priest, as a person who has chosen to serve rather than being assigned to serve." They said, "The god has not objected." They said, "We believe that is permission." Adaeze sat across from the shrine elders in her own compound. She thought about her father kneeling at the altar before she was born. She thought about the chief priest nod on the morning she laid down her consecrated items. She thought about the darkness and what it contained, and the strange shifted quality of the shrine after the flame returned. She thought about 15 days and a man who stayed 12 days past his leaving. She thought about everything she had given, and everything she had been taken, and everything she had argued for and received. And she thought about the difference between service chosen and service assigned, about how the same action performed freely and performed under obligations are two entirely different things, even when they look identical from the outside, about how she had spent 12 years doing the second and was being offered the first. She said, "I have conditions." The elder said, "Name them." She said, "No child is ever again consecrated to the shrine through a vow made before they are born. Any person who served this shrine served by their own choice, made when they are old enough to understand what they are choosing." She said, "The laws of Amadioha are administered with the understanding that the gods made human being human on purpose and hold them to standard appropriate to what he made." She said, "Collective punishment requires collective guilt, and that can be individually demonstrated, not the guilt of proximity or of human nature or of the failure to be stoned in a world designed to make you feel things." The elder looked at each other. The elders said, "Those are significant conditions." Adaeze said, "I know." She said, "I have always presented them to the gods directly." She said, "He did not object then either." The elders looked at the woman sitting across him, the woman who stood in the darkness of the shrine at midnight and said, "You are wrong" to the god of thunder and justice, and walked back out with her voice intact. He said, "Agreed." They say in Nkwere that Adaeze led the shrine of Amadioha for 31 years after that morning, that under her leadership, the shrine became known for a quality of justice that the surrounding village had not previously associated with Amadioha's name. A justice that accounted for the full complicity of human being, that understood the difference between what people did and what they were made to feel, that administered consequence with the precision of someone who had been on the receiving end of imprecise consequences and understood what it cost. They say the god did not object to any of it. They say there were years when the altar flame burned particularly steadily, when the quality of light in the shrine had something in it that the attending priests could not name but recognize as different from ordinary light. They say those were the years when Adaeze stood before the altar and spoke to the gods not as his property and not as his challenger, but as something neither of them had a word for yet. Something between, something new, a human being and a god arriving slowly, imperfectly, at a relationship that neither of them had been designed for, but that both of them apparently capable of. Given sufficient argument, given sufficient darkness, given a woman who knew the law well enough to use them against the lawgiver and was not afraid to. They say she never married. Not because she could not, she could. She had made that clear from the morning she walked out of the shrine with her consecration items left behind. She simply did not. When people asked her why, she gave different answers at different ages. When she was young, she said, I have enough. When she was middle-aged, she said, I am enough. When she was old, she said, I was always enough. It just took me a long time and considerable arguments with the gods to know it. They buried her at the edge of the shrine compound. Her request. She said, I want to be between, not inside the shrine and not outside, on the threshold, where she had spent her whole life anyway. The night they buried her, the altar flame burned higher than it had burned since the night he had stood before it and said, you are wrong. The attending priest who witnessed it wrote down what he saw because he was afraid he would not be believed. He wrote, the flame burned as high as the roof of the shrine. It did not consume anything. It did not spread. It burned for exactly the length of the burial ceremony and then returned to its normal height. He wrote, I did not know what this means. He wrote, I think it means the gods was there. He wrote, I think it means he came to see her off. I think this is what it means too. This has been whispers of the forbidden, where some stories were never meant to be told, but needed to be.